Sarah, a kind-hearted waitress, risks her job to feed Tommy, a hungry 9-year-old boy, at Murphy's family restaurant. Despite her own struggles, she secretly gives him leftovers, forming a bond through small acts of compassion. But on a busy night, the cruel manager, Mr. Parks, publicly shames them both, calling Tommy a charity case and threatening Sarah's job. Humiliated, Tommy flees into the cold night, leaving Sarah heartbroken. The next morning, 4 black Escalades arrive, hinting at a powerful force tied to Tommy's family. Who are they, and what consequences will Parks face for his cruelty? Subscribe to support our mission of sharing inspiring tales that prove love always wins. Share this story, type "feed them," and commit to 1 act of kindness for a hungry child this week. The sharp bark of the manager's voice sliced through the hum of Murphy's family restaurant like a thunderclap, halting forks midair and turning every head in the room. "Stop feeding that boy or you're fired." Mr. Parks' words weren't just a command. They were a public execution of Sarah Martinez's quiet act of kindness. The 26-year-old waitress froze, her hands trembling, as she yanked the plate of warm food away from Tommy, a frail 9-year-old whose small fingers still stretched toward the meal, his face crumpling as tears carved paths down his dirt-smudged cheeks. The silence in the restaurant was suffocating, every patron's gaze pinning Sarah in place like a spotlight. Tommy, his thin frame shivering in clothes that hung like rags on a scarecrow, bolted from the booth and out into the biting cold of the night, his worn shoes slapping against the pavement. Not a single adult in the room moved to stop him, their inaction a heavier weight than the door slamming shut behind him. But the next morning, when 4 sleek black Escalades rolled into the parking lot with the precision of a military operation, a chill of realization swept through the town. They had all misjudged something terribly. Sarah Martinez lived a life that blended into the background of the small, suburban town where gossip was currency, but her own story remained a closely guarded secret. Her world was confined to a cramped studio apartment, its walls bare except for a faded photo of her mother, and her days were measured by the rhythm of her walks to work. Her only transportation since a car was a luxury far beyond her reach. Tucked behind her driver's license in her worn wallet was a small, laminated card, its edges frayed but its words still crisp. Honor student, full scholarship recipient. Once, that card had been her ticket to a different life. Sarah had been the valedictorian of her high school, her future bright with the promise of medical school and a full-ride scholarship. But when her mother's cancer diagnosis came, it was like a rug pulled from under her dreams. Sarah had abandoned everything, her studies, her ambitions, her future, to care for her mother, pouring every cent from minimum wage jobs into treatments that, in the end, couldn't save her. 3 years later, the grief still clung to Sarah like a shadow, but she carried it quietly. Serving families at Murphy's who laughed and ate without a second thought, unaware of the sacrifices woven into her every step. It was during one of those endless night shifts that Sarah first noticed Tommy. He was a wisp of a boy, no older than 9, slipping into the restaurant near closing time when the tables were mostly empty. His clothes were threadbare, his sneakers riddled with holes that let in the rain, and his gaunt frame told a story of hunger that no child should know. He'd sit in the back corner booth, his big brown eyes following plates of food with a longing so raw it pierced Sarah's heart. She'd overheard the whispers among the staff. Tommy lived with his grandmother, a woman too sick to work and too proud to beg. Left to raise a boy abandoned by parents who'd vanished into the wind. Tommy was a ghost in the town, seen but not acknowledged. His hunger a quiet truth everyone chose to ignore. Sarah couldn't look away. Each night she'd gather scraps from the kitchen, a dinner roll, a bowl of soup, a slice of pie past its prime, and slip them to Tommy when no one was watching. Her movements were careful, almost reverent, as if the act of feeding him was a sacred ritual. She'd offer a gentle smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't let anyone see, okay?" Tommy would nod, his solemn eyes brimming with a gratitude that weighed on Sarah's soul. No child should feel such profound relief over a half-eaten roll. She saw her younger self in him, the girl who'd relied on school lunch programs to quiet her own growling stomach, who'd known what it was to feel invisible. Back then, kind strangers had been her lifeline, and now she was determined to be Tommy's. "Why do you bother?" her coworker Jessica asked one night, her tone sharp with judgment as she wiped down a counter. "He's not your problem." Sarah's fingers brushed the honor student card in her wallet, its weight grounding her. She thought of the teachers who'd slipped her extra food, the neighbors who'd checked in when her mother was too weak to cook. "Someone has to care," she said softly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "If not me, then who?" Jessica had rolled her eyes, but Sarah didn't care. She kept every crayon-drawn note Tommy left her, stick figures holding hands, scrawled words like, "Thank you, Miss Sarah, you are nice," in a small box at home, each one a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward. One frigid night, when rain lashed the windows and the air bit at exposed skin, Tommy arrived soaked to the bone, his thin jacket no match for the storm. Sarah's heart twisted at the sight of him shivering, his lips faintly blue. Without a word, she draped her own coat over his narrow shoulders, its warmth swallowing his small frame as he ate the scraps she'd saved. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't a hungry kid in a rundown restaurant. He was just a boy, safe and cared for. "I don't tell nobody about the food," he whispered, his voice small but fierce with loyalty. "It's our secret." Sarah ruffled his damp hair, her smell soft but heavy. "Good," she murmured. "Some grown-ups don't get that helping is always the right thing to do." In that moment, she felt a flicker of pride, a quiet defiance against a world that too often turned its back on kids like Tommy. But that defiance was about to collide with a force she hadn't anticipated. Parks, the restaurant's manager, had been watching her for weeks, his eyes narrowing with every quiet exchange between Sarah and Tommy. He wasn't just disapproving, he was calculating, building a case to stamp out her compassion like it was a crime. To him, Sarah's kindness was a violation, a theft of company resources, and he was determined to make her pay for it. As he stood in the shadows, his clipboard clutched like a weapon, he prepared to turn her act of humanity into a lesson for everyone else. On a bustling Friday night, Murphy's Diner thrummed with the lively chatter of families unwinding after a long work week. The air was thick with the aroma of sizzling burgers and warm apple pie, a comforting backdrop to the clinking of glasses and the laughter of couples on date nights. In the midst of this vibrant scene, Tommy, a wiry 9-year-old with a worn jacket too thin for the chilly evening, slipped into his usual corner booth, hoping to go unnoticed. His small frame hunched over the table, his eyes darting nervously as he tried to blend into the shadows. Every creak of the diner's door made his heart skip, a quiet fear that someone might spot him and demand he leave. He wasn't here for the noise or the warmth of the crowd. He was here for survival, driven by a gnawing hunger that had become his constant companion. Sarah, a waitress with a kind face etched with exhaustion, darted between tables, balancing trays of steaming plates and refilling coffee mugs. Her ponytail swung as she moved, her smile a practiced mask that hid the weight of long shifts and aching feet. She caught sight of Tommy shivering in his corner, his hands tucked into his sleeves for warmth, and her heart clenched. She knew his story, or at least the pieces he'd shared in whispered fragments over weeks of quiet visits. A sick grandmother, a home that was more a shelter than a haven, and a boy too young to carry such burdens. Without a second thought, Sarah slipped into the kitchen, her movements swift but deliberate. She grabbed a bowl of leftover chicken soup, destined for the trash but still warm and hearty, and paired it with a soft dinner roll and a small carton of milk. Returning to Tommy's booth, she set the food before him with a gentle smile, her eyes conveying a silent promise. "You're safe here." Tommy's face lit up, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his guarded expression. His small hands reached for the spoon, trembling not just from the cold, but from the overwhelming relief of a meal he didn't have to beg for. To him, Sarah was more than a waitress. She was a beacon of kindness in a world that often turned its back. He didn't know how to thank her, so he offered a shy nod, his eyes glistening with unspoken appreciation. For Sarah, the act was instinctual, a small rebellion against the indifference she saw too often. She felt a quiet pride in these moments, a sense that she was making a difference, however small, in a boy's life. But the warmth of that moment shattered like glass under the weight of Mr. Park's voice. "Sarah Martinez!" His shout sliced through the diner's hum, sharp and explosive, silencing every conversation. Forks paused midair, heads swiveled, and the air grew heavy with tension. Sarah froze, the empty tray in her hands trembling as if it could feel her rising panic. Her pulse raced, her stomach twisting as every pair of eyes in the crowded diner fixed on her. Families with wide-eyed children, elderly couples clutching their coffee cups, teenagers whispering to each other. The silence was suffocating, a collective judgment that pressed against her chest. "What do you think you're doing?" Mr. Park's voice boomed again, his face flushed a deep, theatrical purple. He stood at the center of the diner, a self-appointed judge, his eyes gleaming with a rage that seemed more performance than genuine. Sarah's mouth opened, but words caught in her throat. I was just," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, drowned by the weight of the moment. Her mind raced, replaying her actions, searching for the crime in her kindness. She felt exposed, as if the diner's fluorescent lights had stripped her bare, leaving her vulnerabilities on display for strangers to dissect. "Stealing from my restaurant," Park roared, his words a public accusation that echoed off the walls. "Giving away free food to some street kid." The phrase landed like a slap, and Tommy's spoon clattered to the table, the sound sharp in the stunned silence. His small face crumpled, the fleeting warmth of the soup replaced by a burning shame that spread across his cheeks. He shrank into the booth, his shoulders hunching as if he could disappear entirely. To him, the staring eyes felt like a spotlight, each glance a reminder of his place, or lack thereof, in this world. He was no longer just a boy, he was a spectacle, a street kid, branded for all to judge. His heart pounded, tears stinging his eyes as he fought to hold them back, his small hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor him against the humiliation. Sarah's chest tightened with a mix of anger and helplessness. "He's just hungry," she said softly, her voice trembling but resolute. She forced herself to meet Park's gaze, willing her words to carry the weight of her conviction. "It's just leftover soup that would have been thrown out anyway." Her plea was for Tommy, for the boy whose dignity was being trampled. But it was also for herself, a desperate attempt to reclaim some shred of control in a moment spiraling beyond her grasp. She could feel the eyes of the customers boring into her, some curious, others judgmental. A woman at a nearby table pulled out her phone, the camera's cold lens capturing Sarah's vulnerability for the world to see. A family with 2 young children stared at Tommy as if his poverty might taint them, their whispers like needles pricking his already fragile sense of self. "I don't care if it's garbage," Park bellowed, his voice loud enough to rattle the windows. "This is a business, not a homeless shelter. We don't feed charity cases here." The words were a public execution of Sarah's compassion, each syllable designed to shame. He snatched the bowl of soup from Tommy's table with such force that it sloshed onto the formica, the warm broth pooling like an accusation. Tommy flinched, his small body recoiling as if the spill were a physical blow. His tears broke free, tracing paths through the dirt on his cheeks, each one a silent cry for invisibility. He wanted to run, to escape the eyes that saw him as less than human, but his legs felt heavy, pinned by the weight of Park's words. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking under the strain of holding back her own tears. "He's just a child." Her words were a plea, not just to Park, but to the room, to the humanity she hoped still lingered among the onlookers. She saw the elderly man shaking his head, his disapproval a silent agreement with Park's cruelty. She saw the teenagers snickering, their laughter a sharp edge that cut deeper than they could know. And she saw Tommy, his small frame trembling, his eyes fixed on the table as if it could shield him from the world's judgment. "A child who doesn't belong here," Park snapped, his grip tightening on the bowl as he waved it like a trophy of his authority. "And neither do bleeding heart employees who think they can give away my inventory." His words were a lash, each one striking at Sarah's resolve. She felt her hands shake, not just with fear, but with a burning rage she could barely contain. She wanted to scream, to defend Tommy, to call out the injustice of a man who could humiliate a child for the sake of his ego. But her job, her livelihood, hung in the balance, and the weight of that reality kept her silent. Park turned his attention back to Tommy, his voice rising to address the entire diner. Look at him, he declared, gesturing at the boy like he was a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you enable these people. They keep coming back for handouts. Some customers nodded, their agreement a quiet betrayal that stung Sarah's heart. Others shifted uncomfortably, their silence a different kind of complicity. A few parents pulled their children closer, as if Tommy's hunger might spread like a disease. The boy's face burned brighter, his tears falling faster as he curled into himself, wishing he could vanish entirely. To him, the diner was no longer a refuge but a stage where his shame was the main act. Now everyone in here knows you're just another charity case, Park continued, his voice dripping with disdain. Maybe next time you'll think twice before coming where you don't belong. Each word was a hammer, driving Tommy deeper into his humiliation. He felt small, smaller than he'd ever felt, as if the world had decided he was nothing more than a problem to be swept away. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. "Mr. Park, please stop," she said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and fury. "You're scaring him." Her words were a desperate attempt to protect Tommy, to shield him from the cruelty that had seemed to grow with every passing second. But Park's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Good," he said coldly. "Maybe he'll learn." He turned to Sarah, his expression hardening. "And you? This is your final warning. I don't run a soup kitchen. If I catch you giving away one more crumb to any of these freeloaders, you're fired on the spot." He grabbed her arm, his grip rough and unyielding, pulling her closer to drive his point home. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible as tears of rage and shame burned her eyes. The words felt like a betrayal, a surrender to a man who wielded his power like a weapon. Park wasn't satisfied. "Louder," he demanded, his voice a command that echoed through the diner. "I want everyone to hear you agree." "Yes, sir," Sarah said, her voice cracking as she forced the words out, each one a wound to her pride. She felt the weight of every stare, the judgment of strangers who saw her as either a fool or a thief. Her heart ached for Tommy, for the boy whose small act of survival had been turned into a public spectacle. Tommy couldn't take it anymore. With a sudden, desperate burst of energy, he bolted from the booth, his small body weaving through the maze of staring customers. His sobs shook his frame, each one a release of the pain he could no longer contain. The diner's door slammed behind him, the sound sharp and final, like the breaking of something fragile. To him, it was the sound of his dignity shattering, the last shred of safety torn away. Park turned to the diners, his demeanor shifting to one of false contrition. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for that disruption," he announced, his voice smooth now, as if he hadn't just crushed two souls. "This restaurant serves paying customers only. We don't tolerate panhandling or theft." A smattering of applause broke out from a few tables, a sound that made Sarah's stomach churn. One man, his face flushed with self-righteous approval, called out, "Thank you for standing up to that nonsense." The words were a final blow, a confirmation that the world, or at least this corner of it, had chosen cruelty over compassion. Sarah stood frozen, her tray still trembling in her hands, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She felt the sting of her own powerlessness, the ache of knowing she couldn't protect Tommy from the world's harshness. And Tommy, now outside in the cold night, ran with no destination, his tears blurring the world around him. Neither of them knew that this moment, this public humiliation, was only the beginning. That Tommy's grandmother, the frail woman he cared for, held secrets and connections that reached far beyond the walls of Murphy's diner. In the darkness of their shared pain, a spark of something greater waited, unseen but powerful, ready to transform their quiet acts of kindness into something extraordinary. Sarah stood rooted to the spot in the dining room, her heart pounding as every pair of eyes in the restaurant turned to her, their gazes sharp with judgment. Some customers still held their phones aloft, recording the fallout of the incident, their screens capturing a moment that made her feel like she was shrinking into nothingness. She had never felt so small, so utterly helpless, as if the world had stripped her bare and left her defenseless. The weight of their stares pressed against her chest, threatening to crush her. "Back to work," Park snapped, his voice cutting through the fog of her thoughts like a whip. "And clean up that mess the kid left." His words dripped with contempt, as though Tommy was nothing more than a nuisance to be erased. Sarah's legs trembled as she made her way to the booth Tommy had fled from, each step feeling like a march through quicksand. The table bore the remnants of his brief presence. A bowl of soup, barely touched, its surface now skimmed over with a dull film and a dinner roll, cold and abandoned, like a forgotten promise. Her gaze fell to the vinyl seat, where small, damp spots marked where Tommy's tears had fallen, silent evidence of a child's broken heart. Reaching beneath the table to clear the debris, her fingers brushed against a piece of paper. She pulled it out and her breath caught. It was a crayon drawing, the lines wobbly but filled with care. A stick figure woman in a waitress uniform holding hands with a small boy. At the bottom, in crooked, childish letters, it read, "Sarah is my friend." The words hit her like a punch, and she pressed the drawing to her chest, the paper crinkling against her apron. Her vision blurred as tears spilled over, not just for Tommy, but for the ache in her own heart, the guilt of standing by while a child was shamed. The restaurant buzzed back to life around her, as if nothing had happened. Customers resumed their chatter, their laughter mingling with the clink of glasses and the scrape of forks on plates. But Sarah couldn't shake the image of Tommy's face. The way his eyes had widened with hurt when Parks had called him a charity case in front of everyone. She couldn't forget the faint, trembling whisper of his voice, thanking her each night for something as simple as food. It haunted her as she moved through her shift, serving tables with a forced smile, her mind elsewhere. Deep inside, a resolve took root. She didn't care about Parks' threats or the risk to her job. If Tommy came back tomorrow, she would find a way to protect him, to make sure he never felt that small again. What she couldn't know as she wiped down tables and refilled coffee cups was that Tommy's return would bring a storm she could never have imagined, and that Parks was about to face a force far greater than his own. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Murphy's family restaurant early, her body heavy with exhaustion. Sleep had eluded her, her mind trapped in a loop of Tommy's tear-streaked face and the sting of her own inaction. She tied on her apron, her heart aching with worry about whether she'd ever see the boy again. Then, a sharp sound shattered the quiet, car doors slamming after another with a deep, expensive thud that echoed like gunshots through the parking lot. She rushed to the window, her stomach plummeting. 4 black Escalades stood in perfect formation, their tinted windows so dark they seemed to absorb the morning light. The chrome gleamed like mirrors, and an aura of authority radiated from them, sending a shiver down her spine. This wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate. "What the hell?" Parks muttered, appearing beside her, his usual bravado faltering as he peered out. From the lead Escalade stepped a woman in her 70s, her silver hair catching the sunlight. She wore a tailored black coat that screamed wealth, likely worth more than Sarah's wages for months. Her posture was military straight, exuding old money in absolute control. Behind her came 4 men in dark suits, their movements sharp and synchronized, not corporate types, but the kind of security who guarded the elite. Their presence was daunting, but it was the 5th figure that stopped Sarah's heart. Tommy stepped out of the second Escalade, no longer the shivering, hungry boy from the night before. He wore crisp, new clothes and polished shoes, his small hand held confidently by a man in a full military dress uniform, a United States Army colonel, his chest adorned with ribbons that spoke of battles fought and leadership earned. Sarah's mind reeled, struggling to process the transformation. The silver-haired woman surveyed Murphy's with the intensity of a general sizing up a battlefield. When she spoke, her voice sliced through the parking lot, commanding instant obedience. "Is this the establishment where my grandson was humiliated last night?" Sarah's knees buckled. Grandson? Tommy's grandmother wasn't some frail, sickly figure. She was a powerhouse, connected in ways Sarah couldn't fathom. The restaurant door swung open, and the group entered like a tidal wave. The elderly woman led the charge, followed by Tommy and the colonel, with the security detail fanning out to secure the exits. The restaurant fell silent, the laughter and clinking glasses replaced by a tense hush as customers sensed the arrival of something unstoppable. The aroma of fresh pancakes filled the air, a comforting scent that contrasted sharply with the tension brewing in the small diner. Sarah stood behind the counter, her hands nervously smoothing her apron as she felt the weight of a gaze settle on her. A woman, elegant and poised despite her age, surveyed the room with a quiet intensity. Her eyes, sharp yet kind, finally locked onto Sarah's. "Are you the young woman who showed compassion to my grandson?" she asked, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to pierce through the nervous hum of the restaurant. Sarah's throat tightened. She managed a small nod, words escaping her as her heart raced. She wasn't sure why this moment felt so monumental, but the air seemed to crackle with unspoken significance. The woman straightened, her presence commanding the attention of every patron in the room. "My name is Margaret Thompson," she declared, her voice clear and resonant, as if addressing a grand assembly rather than a modest diner. "Some of you may know my name from the Children's Hospital downtown, or perhaps the Veterans Shelter on 5th Street. Maybe you've heard of the scholarship fund that helps underprivileged children pursue their dreams at college." A ripple of unease passed through the restaurant. Diners shifted in their seats, forks pausing mid-bite. Margaret Thompson wasn't just a name, she was a legacy. Her wealth wasn't merely financial. It was woven into the fabric of the city, funding entire charities, influencing mayors, and shaping lives. She was the kind of philanthropist whose name graced buildings and whose influence could move mountains. Sarah's breath caught as she realized the gravity of the woman standing before her. Margaret gestured to the man beside her, his military uniform crisp and imposing. "This is my son, Colonel James Thompson," she continued, her tone swelling with pride. "He's just returned from his 3rd tour of duty overseas, only to learn that his nephew, my grandson, was publicly shamed in this very establishment for the simple act of being hungry." Colonel Thompson stepped forward, his presence like a gathering storm. His posture was rigid, his jaw set, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen battlefields and commanded respect without ever raising his voice. When he spoke, his words were deliberate, each one landing like a hammer. "Last night, the manager of this restaurant verbally attacked a 9-year-old boy in front of dozens of witnesses," he said, his voice low but commanding. "He called my nephew a charity case, a street kid, and told him he didn't belong here." His gaze swept the room, finally settling on Mr. Parks, the manager, whose face had drained of color, leaving him as pale as the paper napkins on the tables. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched Mr. Parks shrink under the colonel's stare. She could still hear his cruel words from the night before, the way he'd berated little Tommy, his voice dripping with disdain. The memory made her stomach churn, not just because of the injustice, but because she'd felt so powerless to stop it. She'd wanted to scream, to defend the boy, but fear of losing her job had kept her silent. Now, as Colonel Thompson's words filled the room, she felt a flicker of vindication, though it was tinged with guilt for her own inaction. The colonel continued, his voice steady but laced with restrained fury. "That child is the grandson of one of the city's most generous philanthropists and the nephew of a decorated army officer. But more importantly, he's a little boy who was hungry and should never have been made to feel ashamed for needing help." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Sarah noticed several customers lower their eyes, perhaps recalling how some had clapped for Mr. Parks the previous night, emboldening his cruelty. Margaret Thompson reached down and took Tommy's small hand in hers, her grip gentle but firm. The boy stood between his grandmother and uncle, his eyes wide but his chin lifted with a quiet dignity that tugged at Sarah's heart. Margaret's voice softened as she addressed the room again, but there was an edge to it now, a mother's protective fierceness. "My husband gave his life serving this country," she said, her words carrying the weight of loss. "My son has sacrificed years of his life defending your freedoms. And this child, this brave, beautiful boy, has endured more hardship and loss than most adults could ever comprehend." Her gaze swept over the diners, lingering on those who had cheered for Mr. Parks's harshness the night before. Sarah could feel the shame radiating from them, their earlier bravado replaced by discomfort. Margaret's eyes softened as she continued. "And yet, when one young woman showed him the simple decency of feeding a hungry child, this establishment chose to punish her kindness." Sarah's cheeks burned as all eyes turned to her. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the weight of their stares made her want to shrink into herself. But there was something in Margaret's expression, something warm and encouraging, that kept her rooted in place. Tommy, standing tall despite his small frame, looked directly at Sarah, his voice clear and unwavering. "Miss Sarah was nice to me every day," he said, his words simple but heavy with gratitude. She never made me feel bad about being hungry. Sarah's eyes stung with unshed tears. She remembered the quiet moments when she'd slip Tommy an extra pancake or a glass of milk, always careful not to draw attention. She hadn't thought much of it, just a small act to ease the hunger she saw in his eyes. But now, hearing Tommy speak, she realized those moments had meant more to him than she'd ever imagined. Colonel Thompson pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate. "This footage was taken by another customer last night," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "It shows a restaurant manager berating a child and threatening an employee for showing compassion." He pressed play, and Mr. Park's voice filled the room, harsh and unmistakable. "Street kid, charity case, doesn't belong here." The words echoed, each one a blow, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she relived the moment. She could see Tommy's small shoulders slump in the video, his face crumpling under the weight of the manager's cruelty. Margaret Thompson reached into her purse and pulled out a checkbook, her movements graceful but purposeful. "Mr. Parks," she said, her tone calm but unyielding, "I'm writing a check for $10,000. This will cover every meal my grandson might eat here for the next several years." She signed the check with a flourish, her pen moving with the confidence of someone who knew the power of her name. She handed it to the manager, whose hands trembled as he took it. "This is not charity," she said bluntly. "This is payment in advance, and if I ever hear of this child or any other hungry child being treated with disrespect in this establishment again—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Colonel Thompson leaned forward slightly, his presence amplifying the unspoken threat. "The Thompson family has significant influence in this community," he said, his voice low and measured. "We fund police benevolent associations, veterans programs, and children's services. We also maintain close relationships with health inspectors, business licensing boards, and local media." The words were polite, almost conversational, but they carried a weight that made the air feel thicker. Mr. Parks's hands shook harder, the check crinkling in his grip. Sarah could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Margaret turned to Sarah, her face softening into a smile that seemed to light up the room. "Young lady," she said, her voice warm and inviting, "would you please join us for lunch? I'd like to hear more about the kindness you showed my grandson." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She glanced around the restaurant, taking in the customers who had watched Tommy's humiliation in silence. Mr. Parks still clutching the check like a lifeline, and the security detail standing discreetly nearby, their presence a quiet assurance of protection. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a spark of courage ignite within her. "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice steady and stronger than she'd ever thought possible. "I'd be honored." As they sat down at the best table in the house, Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle over her, not as a burden, but as a promise of something new. She looked at Tommy, who gave her a shy smile, and at Margaret, whose eyes sparkled with gratitude. Colonel Thompson sat with quiet dignity, his presence a reminder of the strength that backed this family. For the first time, Sarah felt seen, not as a waitress scraping by, but as someone who had made a difference, however small. And as the conversation began, she knew this lunch was more than a meal. It was the start of something she couldn't yet name, but that felt like hope. At the cozy, bustling Murphy's family restaurant, Tommy slid into the booth beside Sarah, his small frame brimming with a quiet excitement. His eyes sparkled with trust as he leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "I told them you're my friend," he said, his words carrying the weight of a child's unfiltered admiration. "I told them you're the kindest person in the whole wide world." Across the table, Margaret Thompson's face softened, her smile radiating warmth and approval. "From everything I've heard, Tommy," she said gently, "you're absolutely right about Sarah." Her words seemed to ripple through the restaurant, transforming the atmosphere in an instant. The staff, who moments before had been going through the motions, now buzzed with a newfound eagerness to serve their table. Waiters who had been indifferent the previous night now offered extra napkins and warm smiles. Even the other patrons, some of whom had cast judgmental glances just hours earlier, softened. A few offered shy, apologetic nods in Sarah and Tommy's direction, their faces tinged with guilt for their earlier coldness. But this shift in the restaurant's mood was only the beginning of a deeper, more profound justice that was starting to unfold. The transformation at Murphy's didn't stop at warm smiles or polite gestures. It spread like wildfire, touching every corner of the community. By midday after the Thompson family's visit, the air in the restaurant felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Mr. Parks, the manager who had once loomed over the establishment with his harsh demeanor, was gone. The restaurant's owner, a kind-hearted man who rarely intervened in daily operations, had arrived that morning. His face was etched with regret as he personally apologized to Margaret Thompson for the events of the previous night. In a quiet, dignified moment, he accepted Parks's resignation, ensuring the man's cruelty would no longer taint the restaurant's spirit. By the entrance, a new sign gleamed with pride: Murphy's Family Restaurant, where everyone belongs. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise, one that began to reshape the very soul of the place. Beyond corporate policies or new signage, the change ran deeper, touching the hearts of those who had witnessed or contributed to the previous night's unkindness. Among those moved to make amends was a woman who had been at the restaurant the night before, her phone raised to capture Tommy's humiliation. She returned during the lunch rush, her eyes red and swollen from tears she couldn't hold back. Approaching Sarah with a trembling hand, she held out a handwritten letter, her voice breaking with remorse. "I was one of those people last night," she admitted, her words heavy with shame. "I thought I was recording something amusing, something to share for laughs. But when I watched the video later, I saw myself for who I'd become. Someone cruel, someone thoughtless. I deleted it immediately and donated $200 to the children's food program at Tommy's school. It's not enough, but it's a start." Her confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, as Sarah listened, her heart caught between the sting of the memory and the hope of redemption. Others followed suit, each seeking to right their wrongs. An elderly man who had once clapped in approval of Parks's harsh words returned with his grandson in tow. His weathered face was solemn as he approached Tommy, his voice steady but laced with regret. "I was wrong," he said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I thank that man for what he did, and I shouldn't have." "Grown-ups make mistakes, son," he told his grandson, who watched with waiting, curious eyes. "But real men own up to them and try to do better." He extended a hand to Tommy, introducing his grandson and encouraging the boys to talk. As they sat together, Tommy's shy smile grew, his confidence bolstered by the old man's humility and the chance to connect with someone his own age. A family who had once pulled their children away from Tommy, shielding them as if his presence were a threat, now welcomed him to their table. Their kids, once hesitant, now pushed a basket of crispy French fries toward them, their faces lit with curiosity. "What's your favorite cartoon?" one of them asked, breaking the ice. Tommy's eyes lit up as he launched into an animated description of his favorite show, his laughter mingling with theirs. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged, like he was just another kid enjoying a meal with friends. The simple act of sharing fries became a bridge, mending the distance that cruelty had created. Margaret Thompson's involvement didn't end with a single gesture. Her heart, stirred by Sarah's selflessness and Tommy's resilience, drove her to do more. She established the Sarah Martinez Kindness Fund right there in Murphy's, a program designed to ensure no child in the community would go hungry. Backed by the Thompson Foundation, the fund promised free meals to any child in need, no questions asked. At a press conference in the restaurant's dining room, surrounded by local reporters and curious onlookers, Margaret stood tall, her voice steady with conviction. "This young woman," she said, gesturing to Sarah, who stood nearby, her cheeks flushed with a mix of pride and humility, "represents the best of what it means to be human." While others saw a hungry child and felt annoyance or indifference, Sarah saw a need and met it with love. She reminds us that kindness isn't just a choice, it's a legacy. The story spread far beyond the small town, not as a tale of shame as Mr. Parks had intended, but as a beacon of hope. Online, people shared their own stories of quiet compassion, each post a testament to the power of small acts to change lives. Sarah's kindness became a movement, a reminder that empathy could ripple outward, touching hearts far beyond the walls of Murphy's. At Tommy's school, the impact was just as profound. The principal invited Sarah to speak at an assembly, where she stood before a sea of 300 children, clutching a colorful crayon drawing Tommy had made for her. In her pocket, she carried her old honor student card, a relic of dreams she'd once thought lost. As she spoke, her voice was steady, her words simple but powerful. Being smart isn't just about what you know, she told the children, their eyes fixed on her. It's about understanding that everyone deserves kindness, no matter who they are or what they've been through. The drawing in her hands felt like a badge of honor, a reminder that education wasn't confined to classrooms. It was in the way you treated others, in the courage to stand up for what was right. Murphy's itself became a hub of goodwill, a place where the community gathered to give back. Margaret Thompson hosted monthly kindness club meetings where children learned about empathy and service through hands-on projects. Tommy, now dressed in new clothes and radiating a confidence that had once been buried under hunger and fear, became the club's first junior ambassador. His smile, once tentative, was now wide and genuine, a reflection of the love and support that had lifted him up. Even Colonel Thompson, Margaret's husband, made his mark. On leave before his next deployment, he became a regular at Murphy's, his decorated uniform a quiet symbol of strength and respect. His presence shifted the restaurant's atmosphere, reminding everyone, staff and patrons alike, that dignity and kindness were non-negotiable. The booth where Tommy had once sat alone, his small frame hunched over a single plate, was transformed into the friendship table. A small plaque, polished and gleaming, bore the words, "Reserved for anyone who needs to know they're not alone." In the heart of a bustling diner where the clatter of plates and the hum of conversations filled the air, a small table stood as a beacon of solace. Tucked in a quiet corner, it became a haven for those who needed it most. Elders seeking companionship, teenagers wrestling with the weight of their struggles, or anyone yearning to feel anchored in a world that often felt adrift. This table, unassuming yet profound, was a testament to the compassion of Sarah Martinez, a waitress whose heart refused to turn away from those in need. Sarah's rise to assistant manager wasn't born from the glare of public attention or calculated ambition. It came from the quiet recognition of her new manager, who saw in her a rare blend of leadership and empathy. Sarah didn't just serve meals, she served dignity, understanding, and hope. Her first act in her new role was to launch a Pay It Forward program, a simple yet transformative initiative that allowed customers to purchase meals for families who couldn't afford them. Each transaction was more than a meal. It was a lifeline, a reminder that kindness could ripple through a community, touching lives in ways no one could predict. But the change that held the deepest meaning was one that unfolded in the soft glow of evening when Sarah's shift came to an end. Waiting for her without fail was Tommy, a 9-year-old boy whose life had once been shadowed by hunger and fear. Now he stood proudly, accompanied by his grandmother or uncle, ready to walk Sarah to her car. The gesture was small, but carried the weight of a profound bond. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of dusk, Tommy looked up at her, his eyes steady and full of gratitude. "You took care of me when no one else would," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "Now it's my turn to take care of you." In that moment, Sarah's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and tenderness. She remembered the boy who had once fled into the night, tears streaming down his face, chased by the harshness of a world that had failed him. Now he stood tall, surrounded by the love of his family, his confidence a quiet rebellion against the forces that had once tried to break him. Tommy's transformation was a living testament to the power of compassion, a power Sarah had wielded without hesitation, driven by the simple belief that no child should go hungry. Sarah's kindness had been instinctive, untainted by knowledge of Tommy's background. She didn't know he was a Thompson, a name tied to wealth, military connections, and a philanthropist grandmother whose influence could shift the course of lives. To Sarah, Tommy was just a child, a hungry, frightened boy who needed someone to see him. She fed him because her heart couldn't do otherwise. She protected him because it was right, not because she expected reward or recognition. Her compassion was a universal force, offered without condition or expectation, a beacon of humanity in a world too often clouded by judgment. In contrast, Mr. Parks, the former manager, had embodied a mindset that poisons communities. He saw poverty as a mark of worthlessness, need as a burden, and kindness as a weakness to be exploited. His assumptions were not just wrong, they were catastrophic, tearing at the fabric of human connection. He failed to see what Sarah understood instinctively, that every person, no matter their circumstances, carries inherent value. His dismissal of Tommy wasn't just a personal failure. It was a reflection of a broader societal lie, that helping others is naive, that compassion makes you a fool, that charity breeds dependency. Sarah's story shatters that lie with undeniable force. Her kindness wasn't wasted, even when its impact wasn't immediately visible. Every meal she gave Tommy, every gentle word she offered, every moment she spent affirming his worth was a brick laid in the foundation of something greater. She couldn't have known the full scope of her actions, how they would ripple outward, touching not just Tommy, but an entire community. But that's the truth cynics fail to grasp. You never know who you're helping. And it doesn't matter. The child you feed might be the grandson of a philanthropist, or they might be a foster kid fighting to survive. The struggling student you encourage might one day save lives, or they might simply find the strength to keep going. The homeless veteran you acknowledge might carry a story of heroism, or they might just need someone to remind them they're human. Kindness doesn't demand a pedigree or a promise of reward. It's a gift given freely, rooted in the belief that every person deserves to be seen, valued, and cared for. Sarah's compassion wasn't about Tommy's connections. It was about his humanity. And in choosing kindness over convenience, love over fear, she changed the trajectory of his life and countless others who found refuge at that quiet table in the diner. Sometimes justice arrives with fanfare, as it did when Tommy's grandmother stepped in, her influence ensuring accountability. But more often, it comes quietly, in the satisfaction of knowing you did what was right when it mattered most. Sarah's reward wasn't wealth or fame. It was the sight of Tommy standing tall, the warmth of his family's gratitude, the knowledge that her actions had planted seeds of hope in a world desperate for it. This is the challenge Sarah's story lays before us: to be the Sarah in our own communities, to seek out the Tommies in our world. Somewhere right now, there's a child sitting alone, their stomach empty, their heart heavy with the question of whether anyone cares. They might be the kid whose parents work endless hours but still can't make ends meet. They might be a teenager sleeping in a car, or a foster child facing an uncertain future. Whoever they are, they deserve kindness. Not because of who they might become, but because of who they are right now, human, hurting, and in need of hope. So look for them. Feed them when they're hungry. Comfort them when they're hurting. Remember them when the world forgets. Your act of kindness that might be the only thing standing between them and despair. Don't let them wait. Don't let them wonder if they matter. Show them they belong, because everyone deserves a place where they are seen, loved, and protected. Sarah's story began with a single act of courage, and it changed everything. Yours can too.